My name is Sophie, and I'm 28 years old. I live in a modest but cozy apartment in my hometown with my 7-year-old daughter, Emma. Life had never been perfect, but I always thought I had it figured out, or at least as much as a single mom juggling work, bills, and a little girl's endless energy could. I wasn't rich, I wasn't famous, but I had stability, a little independence, and Emma. That was enough, or so I thought. It all began on what seemed like an ordinary afternoon. I had just gotten home from my part-time job at a local bookstore. My arms were full of grocery bags, my hair messy from running errands, and my mind half on dinner and half on the stack of emails I'd promised myself I'd answer later. Emma came running toward me, her small frame practically vibrating with nervous energy. Mom, she called, holding something tightly in her hands. Her eyes were wide, a mix of fear and hesitation. "What is it, baby?" I asked, crouching to her level. She handed me a folded piece of paper. "Grandma and Grandpa gave me this for you," she whispered. I frowned. My parents didn't usually hand notes to Emma for me. They called or sometimes texted, but this felt different. I unfolded the paper, expecting maybe a simple reminder, a scribbled joke, or Emma's little doodle. But what I saw made my heart stop. "Please move out before we get back." I blinked, thinking I must be reading it wrong. I looked at Emma. "Are you sure this is from Grandma and Grandpa?" I asked, my voice tight. She nodded, her little chin trembling. I sank onto the couch, holding the note like it might burn me. My mind raced. Move out from my own home, my parents, the people who had given me life were asking me to leave, and all because, why, I couldn't figure it out. Had I done something terrible? Had I missed a call, a text, an important event? No, nothing explained this. I stared at Emma, who fidgeted beside me, her small hands clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. I felt my chest tighten. A wave of confusion, disbelief, and hurt crashed over me. I remembered every small insult, every subtle judgment, every time my parents made me feel inadequate. None of it had seemed like a big deal back then, just harmless comments, they said. But now it all made sense. This note wasn't just a random instruction. It was the culmination of years of passive-aggressive hostility. I picked up my phone and considered calling them immediately, demanding an explanation. But something inside me stopped me. Anger flared, yes, but I also felt a spark of resolve. I wasn't going to cry over a note. I wasn't going to beg for approval. Something had to change, and I realized this was my moment. "Mom, are you going to move out?" Emma asked, her small voice trembling. I pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "No, baby, we're not going anywhere," I said firmly. "We'll figure this out, but we won't let anyone make us feel small." Sitting there, with Emma's warm little hand in mine, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to survive this, I was going to turn it around. I would prove to my parents, and maybe even to myself, that I was strong, capable, and deserving of respect. And that tiny piece of paper, it had just lit a fire inside me. From that moment on, I knew my life was about to change. I didn't know exactly how or when, but I was certain of one thing. I would face this challenge head-on, and I wouldn't let anyone, especially not my own parents, define me or my future. After I folded the note and tucked it away, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I sat at the kitchen table, Emma quietly drawing at her little art desk, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. My parents had always been complicated. They loved me, I thought, in their own way, but they had always had a way of making me feel small. It wasn't that they were openly cruel. No, their way of hurting me was far more subtle. They would praise my cousin's achievements in front of me, make offhand comments about my struggles, or dismiss the choices I made as a young adult trying to find my footing. Sometimes I thought I was imagining things, convincing myself I was too sensitive. But now, holding that note in my hand, I realized it had all been building toward this moment. I remembered the first time I had felt that sting, the time I had graduated college and proudly showed my parents my degree. My mom had smiled politely, then said, "Well, you're smart, but don't expect it to get you far without the right connections." My dad had added, "Yeah, you'll need to figure out how to survive in the real world. It's harsh out there." I had laughed it off, telling myself they were just concerned. But deep down, I had felt belittled. And there were other memories. Birthday parties where my successes were ignored. Holiday dinners where I was subtly compared to my cousins. Conversations that left me walking away with a pit in my stomach. My parents didn't just dislike me, they wanted to control me, to shape me into their version of acceptable. and this note was the cruelest manifestation of that control. I realized that, intentionally or not, they had never seen me as an independent adult. Not really. They still treated me like a child, despite the fact that I was raising my own daughter, paying my bills, and handling responsibilities that they didn't even understand. That note wasn't just a request, it was an ultimatum, a power play. And I would not let it define me. I began to think strategically. I needed to understand my parents' motives before I reacted. Why now? What had prompted this note? Was it because I had recently bought Emma's school supplies without consulting them? Was it because I had refused to accept a loan from them? Or was it simply their need to remind me that, in their eyes, I was still a child who could be kicked out on a whim? I started quietly reviewing the timeline in my head. Every small slight, every moment where I had felt dismissed, suddenly made sense as a part of a larger pattern. It wasn't just me being sensitive, it was them being controlling, and now they were showing their hand. Sitting there, I felt a strange mix of sadness, anger, and clarity. Sadness for the way they had made me feel over the years. Anger that they thought they could intimidate me with a simple note. But most importantly, clarity. I understood that I didn't need their permission, their approval, or their blessing to live my life. Emma glanced up from her drawing and smiled, innocent and trusting. "Mom, are you going to be okay?" she asked. I pulled her onto my lap and held her close. "Yes, baby, we're going to be more than okay. We're going to show everyone that we're strong, and we don't need anyone to tell us our worth." That night, I went to bed with a determination I hadn't felt in years. The note from my parents had been meant to hurt me, to scare me, to remind me of my place. Instead, it had lit a fire inside me. I was going to take this hurt and turn it into something powerful. I was going to prove to them, and to myself, that I was capable of far more than they had ever given me credit for. I didn't know exactly how yet, but one thing was clear. My parents had just set me on a path I wasn't planning to leave. And for the first time, I felt the thrill of knowing I was in control of my own destiny. The next few days were strange. I went about my routine, taking Emma to school, going to work, paying bills, but my mind was elsewhere. That note from my parents had shaken me, but instead of despair, it had sparked something sharper: curiosity. I needed to understand them, to see their motives, their weaknesses. I wasn't planning to confront them yet, I wasn't ready for that. For now, I was going to watch and learn. I started by paying attention to their habits and interactions. My parents were meticulous about appearances. They prided themselves on looking perfect in front of relatives, neighbors, and anyone who might judge them. Every dinner, every gathering, every post on social media was carefully crafted to project success and control. And yet, beneath that surface, cracks were forming. Their arrogance often led them to underestimate me. I began making mental notes. My mom always demanded attention at family events, but she never handled criticism well. One misstep from my dad's side of the family, and she would pout or sulk, hoping someone would validate her feelings. My dad, on the other hand, thrived on control and appearances. He was quick to boast, but slow to act when things didn't go exactly his way. Together, their weaknesses were glaring, but I had to be careful. If they suspected I was paying attention, I would lose the upper hand. Emma noticed my quiet intensity. "Mom, you're thinking a lot," she said one afternoon, handing me a drawing she had made. It was simple, a stick figure of us holding hands, but in that little picture I saw her trust. She believed I could handle anything. I smiled and ruffled her hair. "I'm just thinking about how we can make sure we're happy, baby, that's all." While keeping up appearances, I started documenting everything. Small incidents, tiny slights, conversations that revealed their hypocrisy, all were quietly recorded in a notebook I kept hidden. Every insult, every dismissive comment, every attempt to manipulate or control me became fuel. I realized that knowledge was power. The more I understood them, the better I could plan my next moves. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about control. For too long, my parents had dictated how I should feel, what I should do, even how I should raise Emma. That note had been their attempt to assert dominance one last time. But instead of scaring me, it made me sharper, more alert. Every gesture they made, every comment they whispered, was now part of a larger map I was drawing in my mind. There were moments of quiet satisfaction. I caught my dad trying to belittle a distant cousin at a family brunch, only for the cousin to subtly call him out. I saw my mom fume when her carefully planned gossip backfired. I realized that even the people who seemed untouchable had cracks, and if I played my cards right, I could turn those cracks into openings. I also began thinking about Emma. I didn't want her to inherit my parents' fear of confrontation or their need for validation. I wanted her to see that strength wasn't always about shouting or fighting. It was about patience, observation, and strategy. I wanted to teach her, by example, that it was possible to rise above cruelty without losing your dignity. By the end of that week, I felt a shift within me. The hurt was still there, but it no longer controlled me. Instead, it had transformed into something else: clarity, purpose, and a growing sense of power. I wasn't just a victim of my parents' arrogance anymore. I was someone who could navigate it, who could outthink them without them ever realizing it. As I tucked Emma into bed that night, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "Mom, I know you'll be okay." I kissed her forehead and whispered back, "We'll be more than okay, baby. We're going to be stronger than anyone ever expected." And deep down, I knew it was true. The game had begun, and I had the advantage. After a week of observation and careful reflection, I realized it was time to shift gears. Watching my parents had taught me a lot, but watching alone wouldn't change my life. I needed to reclaim control, to rebuild my power, both for myself and for Emma. The first step was financial. I had always managed my expenses, but now I became meticulous. I opened a new savings account, started budgeting every single dollar, and looked for small ways to increase my income. I took on extra shifts at the bookstore, agreed to a few freelance projects online, and even sold a few things we no longer needed. Each deposit, each extra paycheck, felt like a tiny victory. I felt my confidence growing with each careful decision. Next, I focused on our home. My apartment wasn't huge, but it was ours. I spent evenings rearranging furniture, painting walls, and decorating in ways that made it feel like our sanctuary. Emma helped wherever she could, placing her little stuffed animals in perfect lines, adding her tiny handprints to canvases we hung on the walls. I wanted our home to reflect our strength and independence, not fear or shame. While I worked on practical matters, I also worked on my mental state. For years, my parents had made me question myself, my decisions, my abilities, even my worth. I refused to let them win that battle. I began journaling daily, noting down my feelings, my achievements, and my goals. Every small win, paying a bill on time, successfully completing a freelance assignment, or simply making Emma smile, was a reminder that I was capable, independent, and strong. Emma noticed the change in me. One evening, she hugged me tightly and said, "Mom, I like it when you're happy." I realized she had been worried, sensing the tension between me and my parents. I smiled and whispered, "I'm happy because we're building our life together, baby, and no one can take that from us." Her wide eyes glimmered with trust and admiration, and in that moment, I knew I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was shaping her understanding of strength and resilience. I also started reconnecting with friends and allies I had drifted away from. For too long, I had isolated myself, letting my parents' subtle control seep into every corner of my life. I called old friends, shared laughter over coffee, and sought advice from those I trusted. Their encouragement reinforced my confidence, reminding me that I had a support network outside my family and that I wasn't alone in this. But I didn't stop there. I began planning subtle ways to assert my independence, small steps that would build toward something bigger. I updated my wardrobe, not for anyone else, but for myself, something that made me feel confident and visible. I started attending local community events, networking, and showing myself to the world as someone capable and self-assured. Every time my parents tried to belittle me, they would find me already one step ahead, calmly thriving while they remained fixated on appearances. And through it all, I kept the note from my parents close, tucked in a drawer but never forgotten. It had started as a symbol of hurt, but now it had become a reminder of why I couldn't fail, a spark of determination to prove that their words could not define my life. By the end of that month, I felt a profound shift. I was no longer reacting to their attempts to control me. I was proactive, deliberate, and in charge of my destiny. Emma and I were stronger, closer, and more confident than ever before. And most importantly, I was beginning to see that the real power wasn't in anger. It was in patience, preparation, and the quiet satisfaction of reclaiming my life. For the first time since receiving that devastating note, I felt truly alive, energized, and ready. My parents had tried to intimidate me, but instead, they had unwittingly lit a fire I wouldn't let die. And I knew deep down that the best part of my journey, my clever, satisfying reversal, was still ahead. A week later, the family gathering arrived. I had been dreading it, yet secretly looking forward to it. My parents had arranged a small dinner with relatives at their house, a carefully curated evening designed to flaunt their wealth, status, and control. I knew this was my chance. The gathering would be full of their typical performances, bragging, subtle insults, and an unspoken hierarchy where I was meant to feel small. Emma held my hand tightly as we stepped inside. "Mom, remember what we practiced?" she whispered. I smiled at her and nodded. "Stay calm, stay smart, and don't let anyone shake us," I reminded her. The room was alive with chatter. My mother glided through it like a queen, her smile perfect but her eyes calculating. My father leaned against the bar, casually mentioning his promotions, vacations, and successful investments, as if anyone in the room could match his standard. I felt the old familiar tension creep into my chest, but this time I didn't allow it to take over. I was prepared. As expected, my parents began their usual routine of indirect criticism. My mom commented on my apartment, "Oh, you've decorated nicely, for a small place." My father added, "And how's work these days? Still managing on your own, I assume?" There it was, their attempt to make me feel inadequate, like I was a child fumbling in an adult world. But instead of shrinking, I smiled and answered with calm confidence. "Yes, actually, work is going very well. I've been taking on some exciting projects, and Emma and I are really enjoying our home. It's been a lot of fun making it our own space." A few relatives whispered among themselves. I could see surprise flicker in their eyes. My parents stiffened. They weren't used to me answering with pride and poise. They expected hesitation, apologies, or meek acceptance. But I didn't give them that satisfaction. Throughout dinner, my parents tried repeatedly to assert dominance. They compared my achievements to my cousins, brought up past mistakes, and even attempted a veiled comment about my parenting. I deflected every comment calmly, sometimes turning it into a story about Emma's successes, subtly highlighting my own competence without attacking anyone. One particularly arrogant comment from my father, about a recent investment that was too big of a risk for someone like me, gave me the perfect opening. I smiled and said, "Actually, I've been researching some investment opportunities myself. Nothing too flashy, but I like taking calculated risks that help me build our future." The relatives glanced at me, impressed. My father's smug smile faltered, replaced with a tight, forced one. As the evening went on, I noticed something important. The more I stayed composed, the more my parents' cracks showed. Their arrogance, their need to control the narrative, and their obsession with appearances became obvious to everyone. Relatives whispered, exchanged looks, and subtly questioned their claims. I could feel the shift in energy. Finally, others were seeing the truth behind my parents' facade. Emma, sitting beside me, whispered, "Mom, you're amazing." I ruffled her hair and whispered back, "Thank you, baby. This is just the beginning." By the end of the evening, I had achieved more than I expected. I had maintained dignity, showcased my independence, and subtly exposed my parents' hypocrisy, all without a single outburst. I realized that the key wasn't confrontation. It was strategy, patience, and quiet strength. As we left the gathering, I held Emma's hand tightly, feeling a rush of satisfaction. My parents had tried to intimidate me with subtle humiliation, but I had turned it into an opportunity to assert myself. For the first time, I felt that I wasn't just surviving their control, I was outsmarting it. Driving home, I reflected on the night. I had planted seeds, small but powerful, for the next stage of my plan. My parents' arrogance and overconfidence were vulnerabilities, and I intended to use them wisely. This family gathering wasn't just a dinner, it was the beginning of my quiet, calculated comeback, a test I had passed with flying colors. And in the back of my mind, I knew the real game, the clever, undeniable reversal, was still to come. After the family gathering, I felt a surge of confidence I hadn't experienced in years. That night, lying in bed beside Emma, I thought about my parents' arrogance and how easily it had blinded them. They had tried to intimidate me with a note, with subtle insults, and with public humiliation, but they had underestimated one thing: me. And now it was time for the next step, my clever reversal. The plan didn't require confrontation or shouting. It required patience, intelligence, and subtlety. I began quietly leveraging opportunities that had always been within my reach, but that my parents assumed I wouldn't notice, or worse, that I couldn't handle. First, I turned to my work. I had been freelancing part-time, helping small businesses with social media and marketing. What started as a side hustle soon became something bigger. I researched potential clients, pitched ideas, and slowly but surely built a small but profitable business. I made sure it was done quietly, without boasting to anyone, so my parents would remain unaware of my growing independence. Then came the next step, my home. My parents had always prided themselves on status and appearances. They loved showing off, judging who had what, so I decided to subtly use this against them. I found a small property for sale, not extravagant, just modest enough to be affordable, but in a neighborhood that carried a hint of prestige. I purchased it quietly, keeping it a secret. To my parents, it seemed like I was still struggling in my little apartment. In reality, I now had financial leverage and independence they couldn't touch. Even more satisfying was the way I carefully shared this progress. A casual mention to a distant relative that I had just bought a little place sparked surprise and curiosity, but my parents didn't know the details. Their arrogance meant they assumed I hadn't achieved anything significant. Their ignorance was my weapon. I also made small personal changes that boosted my confidence. I updated my wardrobe, attended local events, and began speaking more confidently in public settings. These were small victories, but each one chipped away at the illusion my parents had built, that I was dependent, weak, or naive. Every move I made was calculated. I wanted my parents to feel the sting of their underestimation without ever realizing it was deliberate. This wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. It was a demonstration of power, independence, and strategy. The more I flourished, the more obvious it became that their attempts to control me had failed completely. Even Emma played a role. She began to notice the changes, the quiet confidence in me, and the small victories that I celebrated with her. "Mom, you're amazing," she said one afternoon while we were painting her bedroom walls. I hugged her tightly and whispered, "We're amazing, baby, and no one can ever take that away from us." By the end of a few months, the transformation was undeniable. My parents, who had once assumed they could intimidate me with a note or public humiliation, now faced a reality they had never anticipated. I was thriving without them. Their attempts to belittle me had backfired, leaving them frustrated and powerless. And the best part, I had done it without anger, without confrontation, and without losing my dignity. Every success was quiet, elegant, and undeniable. Each small win was a carefully placed piece in a larger puzzle, a puzzle designed to show them that their arrogance and attempts at control had consequences. I realized that real power wasn't in shouting, in revenge for the sake of revenge. It was in strategy, patience, and intelligence. By quietly building my independence, reclaiming my life, and asserting my dignity, I had created a reversal they could never have predicted. As I tucked Emma into bed that night, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The fire that the note had sparked was no longer just about hurt. It had become a force of transformation, strength, and triumph. And the best part? The parents who had tried to control me didn't even realize that I had already won. It didn't take long for the consequences of my quiet strategy to reach my parents. I noticed the subtle shifts first at family gatherings, then in their phone calls, and eventually in their tone whenever they spoke to me. My success, the independence I had quietly built, the property I had purchased, and my growing confidence was impossible for them to ignore. At first, they tried to maintain their usual posture of superiority, pretending that nothing had changed. My mother would drop into conversation. "Well, Sophie, I see you're keeping busy," with a forced, polite smile. My father, never one to admit defeat, would add, "Yes, sounds like you're managing." But the words were hollow, and their discomfort leaked through in small ways: tightened jaws, distracted glances, and the occasional awkward pause. Family members began noticing too. Cousins whispered about how I had bought a property near the neighborhood everyone admired. Friends mentioned my growing business in hushed tones. Even distant relatives complimented Emma and me on our home, praising my independence. Each comment was a small hammer blow to my parents' carefully constructed image of control. I began to see their attempts at manipulation falter. They could no longer make me feel small with subtle jabs or backhanded compliments. Their words had lost power because I had built a fortress of confidence, financial stability, and dignity around myself. Every time they tried to regain control, I remained calm, poised, and unshaken. One afternoon, during a routine phone call, my mother's voice trembled just slightly as she asked, "Sophie, are you really managing everything on your own?" There was an edge of disbelief, a subtle sting of fear that they had underestimated me. I smiled quietly to myself. "Yes, Mom, Emma and I are doing wonderfully. We're really proud of how far we've come." I could hear my mother sigh on the other end, a sound of begrudging acknowledgement. My father, who had always prided himself on his authority, tried to interject, but even he faltered. His control had slipped through his fingers without me ever needing to shout, argue, or confront him directly. The most satisfying moments came when my parents tried to subtly warn me or negotiate, thinking they could regain influence. Offers of loans, property advice, or helpful suggestions were politely declined. I responded with confidence, showing them that I had already built my life in ways they had assumed impossible. Their frustration was palpable, but I didn't gloat. Instead, I let their realization unfold naturally, like a slow sunrise exposing the truth. Emma, as always, was my anchor. She would cheer quietly whenever I made a small decision, buying supplies for a project, signing a contract, or organizing a neighborhood event. "Mom, look at us. We're unstoppable," she would say, and I couldn't help but laugh. Her belief in me mirrored my own growing pride. It was in these moments, quiet but powerful, that I understood the true meaning of my journey. The note from my parents, which had seemed like an attack, had become the catalyst for my independence and transformation. I didn't need to humiliate them. I didn't need revenge in the traditional sense. Their realization of their misjudgment, their inability to control me, was more satisfying than any confrontation could have been. By the end of that period, it was clear that my parents' arrogance had been their downfall. They could see, quietly but undeniably, that I had risen above them. I had taken their attempt to intimidate me and turned it into an opportunity to assert my life, my home, and my dignity. And in those moments, I felt a profound sense of triumph. Not anger, not bitterness, but satisfaction. I had done it the right way, smart, patient, and with dignity intact. I had won the ultimate game, proving my worth, building my life, and showing both my parents and Emma that true strength lies in quiet resilience and strategy. As I tucked Emma into bed that night, she whispered, "Mom, they can't touch us, right?" I kissed her forehead softly and replied, "No, baby, they never could, and they're finally starting to understand that." I smiled to myself, knowing the story was far from dramatic theatrics. It was real life, and in real life, victory was sweetest when it was smart, quiet, and undeniable. The weeks following my parents' quiet realization were some of the most peaceful I had ever experienced. There were no dramatic confrontations, no heated arguments, just a subtle shift in the family dynamic. My parents no longer tried to undermine me. They had begun to understand, slowly and reluctantly, that I was no longer the young, insecure girl they could control with a note or a backhanded compliment. For me, the journey wasn't about making them pay. It was about taking my life back and creating a future where Emma and I could thrive without fear or manipulation. Every small decision I had made, the extra work, the property purchase, the confidence-building projects, had led to this sense of liberation. The note that had once seemed like a dagger now felt like the spark that had lit a fire inside me. Emma thrived alongside me. I saw it in the way she carried herself, how she spoke proudly about her school projects, and how she trusted me to make the right decisions for us. The transformation wasn't just for me, it was for her. I wanted her to grow up knowing that strength comes from resilience, intelligence, and courage, not from shouting or retaliation. I began to reflect on the past, piecing together all the moments my parents had underestimated me. Their constant subtle criticisms, their attempts to shape my decisions, their control over small aspects of my life, it had all been a test, whether intentional or not. But in the end, their attempt to intimidate me had backfired spectacularly. I had not only survived it, but had grown stronger because of it. One evening, as I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea, I finally felt complete peace. Emma was playing with her toys nearby, occasionally glancing at me with a smile that melted my heart. I allowed myself a small, private smile too, I thought about that note, now tucked safely in my drawer, a reminder of how far we had come. I realized that closure didn't require revenge or humiliation. I didn't need to confront my parents or force an apology. Their realization, the shift in the way they viewed me, and the fact that they could no longer control me was enough. That in itself was victory. Quiet, intelligent, and lasting. Over time, I began reaching out to my parents cautiously, establishing boundaries while maintaining civility. I didn't let resentment dominate our interactions, but I also didn't allow them to overstep. There was a new respect, muted, hesitant, but present. They had finally understood that I was my own person, capable and independent. And I had Emma as my constant reminder. Every decision I made, every step I took, was for her as much as it was for me. I had turned a moment of hurt and humiliation into a lifetime lesson of empowerment, not just for myself, but for my daughter. The note that had once shaken me so deeply had become a symbol, not of fear, but of resilience. I kept it in my drawer, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder of the fire it had ignited in me. A fire that had allowed me to rise, to grow, and to reclaim my life with dignity and strength. Looking back now, I understand that real triumph isn't about lashing out or proving someone wrong. It's about quietly building yourself up, step by step, until the world finally notices what they tried to suppress. As Emma curled up beside me that night, I whispered, "We did it, baby. We're unstoppable." And in her sleepy smile, I saw the reflection of our journey, a journey that started with a hurtful note and ended with confidence, independence, and peace. I had faced my parents' attempt to control me, and I had won, not with anger but with patience, strategy, and resilience. And for the first time in years, I felt truly free.